Hello everyone and welcome to part 7 of the Amazon project. Last video I briefly touched on the subject of linkages for the new rear axle. To recap the whole situation, my starting point is a rear axle from a Volvo 940. It's meant to use some weird multi-link system I don't fully understand or like. But from what I've gathered, some kind of trailing arms would mount here to locate the axle and some shoulder links would mount here, taking up the rotational torque as you brake and accelerate. And finally the panhard bar would mount back here to take up sideways movement. I want to instead try a fairly classic 3-link system like this. The 3 blue links take up rotational torque and locate axle lengthwise. Then you have the green panhard bar to keep it located sideways. This is not the exact geometry I'm going to use, just a little visual aid. I started by making my main 3 links, cutting a 6-meter tube down to length with my trusty old hacksaw. Unfortunately, I didn't get much material of the entire process making these, since I was way out of my depth and needed a few brain cells I have to focus, without trying to also manage a camera at the same time. After cutting the tube apart, I aligned them in the mill and cut them to the exact same length. This also makes sure that the faces are perfectly flat for assembly later on. Obviously I have a thing for making everything myself, so I started cutting material for the threaded inserts as well, leaving me with a bunch of these pucks. The puck is now the shiny part with 2 flats. Inside has been bored out for M20 size tap and a smaller diameter has been made towards the rear to fit the tube. The thicker tube is the bushing holder, obviously overkill heavy duty, but I like the look. The small tube and purple parts to the right are polyurethane bushings, meant for a Volvo 240 I think it was. Since I made all of this from oversized solid bar, the amount of chips was ridiculous. I used a 3D printer to make this alignment tool for tapping the puck part, just to make sure it goes in perfectly straight. So that's pretty much a complete set for one end of one axle link. I have now also made that threaded bolt of sorts with the red head. The red part will go into the hole in the bushings holder. This is just to aid with locating it and was made on the mill after making the tube shape in the lathe. So an assembled end piece would look something like this, and slide into the tube itself. So then it was just a matter of making a whole bunch of these until I have 3 complete sets. 3 of them are left hand threaded and 3 of them are right hand threaded. This makes it easier to fine adjust the length of the links later on. After test fitting and making dead sure the right parts were in the right place, I made some small fusion tacks just to keep things together for now. No point in doing final welding until I've tested them with everything else. With my lower links semi-done, I started fabricating some mounts using this square tubing as a starting piece. First milling them to exact length, cutting one side off, milling some contours, drilling bolt holes for the axle links, and finally milling a big round hole for where it attaches to the rear axle. Now I just need to make the mirrored part. Just fitting with the links I made, everything looks pretty good, but I do need to make some placeholders to keep things in shape when I weld this together. Took some scrap aluminium tubing, which I flattened a bit to fit into the tube, and phased them to the exact same length. Using bolts and clamps I could then squeeze this real tight to make sure nothing moves when I weld the 2 halves together. I'm not going to win any Welder of the Year awards, but the penetration seemed really good and I couldn't find any flaws when I ground the welds back down flat along the outside. With some links and mounts made, I started testing things on the axle. Again, it's one of those moments where I just pause and play around with things, so I can figure out how I want to proceed. I had also made this top bracket that I wanted to mount on the differential housing, figuring having it centered would give it the best mechanical advantage. Unfortunately, this also places it really far up, and it's generally not advised to add mounts to the cast housing, but we'll get to that later. With the axle in the right height, it becomes clear how ridiculous the top mount is. If I want the links parallel with the ground, the front bushing would almost sit at torso height and just slightly behind the driver. The lower links end up right in this beam, which I was kinda aware of but figured it would make a strong mounting point. So taking note of everything I figured out, I removed the links and start thinking about how to attach things to the body. The frame is obviously so rotten in the entire middle of the car that I can't mount anything to it. So after welding in some reinforcements, I start cutting more and more of it out, taking it a step at a time, starting with the rear part of it. This let me clean everything up towards the back and cut some tube to work as a new frame. It's just slightly thinner in width, but the steel itself is both thicker and of a better quality, so it should be much stronger. With those tacked in place, I could remove the temporary reinforcements from the middle. I placed the lengthwise tubes as to create a natural continuation from the stock frame going towards the rear. Unfortunately, this made them in line with the suspension links. Not a big issue since I wanted to space out the links anyway. I added some additional reinforcement before cutting more of the front frame out, so I could then continue replacing the bad pieces towards the front. It was quite tricky trying to get this aligned in all different directions, but I think I managed to get it somewhat straight. This then connects back to where the old frame was still solid. This will get fully welded and further reinforcements added to make sure the joints are not a weak point. So this is where we're at now. Following the stock layout to not alter the car too much in that aspect, but it should still be stronger with this steel. Just need to add these little pieces. But obviously need to do something about this rotten area. It was equally bad on both sides, of course. Just keep cutting things to remove all the rust and remnants from the old floor. Ended up with this rather large hole that was just garbage. Making up a new piece to take its place, weld it all in and then blend. Looks pretty decent with the last frame piece tacked in place. And that's pretty much all the bad parts replaced, at least in this area that I know of. At this point I removed the entire axle to shorten and space out the link mounts, but with all my good intentions I accidentally made this when removing a bracket. The bracket I cut off protruded quite a bit from the housing, so I figured it would be solid, but nope. Now I have a big gaping hole into the differential. This is a cast diff and thus I can't weld it easily. So considering my options, instead of making things worse by trying to heat and weld it, I figured I would try to make some kind of cap for it. The inside is a really weird shape which makes it impossible to drill by hand, but I managed to just about fit it in my milling machine. First running a fly cutter to flatten the surface, and then drilling it big enough so I can at least get some threads in there. This whole process had my heart pounding, hoping I wasn't just making things worse. To make it even more nervy, having so much weight to one side of an old worn out machine made the table really difficult to move, and the CNC controls would constantly trigger an overcurrent and turn off. Each time it turns off, you lose position and have to try and dial things back in. Hence this ghetto fix with a big heavy tube to balance things out, whilst also trying to not make it hit my big lathe. Ultra sketchy. In the end I managed to get this semi-round hole and tap it with a, I think it was 3/4 inch. I then made this plug to fill the void, so to say. I will probably fill the inside with JB weld to fill the gap around the threads, making a much better seal, whilst the threads themselves can act as a mechanical lock. Either way, problem solved for now, I guess. Axle back in the car with the mount spaced out to where I want them. The top mount was removed since it was too tall and will be mounted further to the side instead. I will have to fix that huge gaping hole I made in the backrest at some stage. The front bushings will now sit something like this when the car is flat and the links are parallel with the ground. This is where we get to more fun rust. Again, same problem on both sides. Per usual, it's just a matter of removing paint, surface rust, blah blah blah, and then cut the rotten stuff out. Here I opted to remove some extra, just to make the replacement panels easier to make and also get easier access to the frame piece. The area around where the old axle mounts were was both in bad shape and looked like it had been previously repaired, so I removed that entire bit. The frame at these parts is pretty much just 2mm sheet steel, so I bent up some replacements and butt welded everything together. Having made them, I can say they're definitely more difficult to make than they look. It's hard to predict just how the bends will behave when you add several after each other. With the frame repaired, I started looking into covering this part up again. No kidding, this is probably the most complicated piece I have ever done. So many test fits just to get it right towards all the other surfaces. After finally getting it close enough, I did a mix of butt welds and through welds to anchor it to the body and frame. Then it's just a matter of grinding all the welds flush and giving it a quick coat of rust protection. And of course, repeating all of this on the other side. First repairing the frame, then turning this into this, and you can probably tell how tired I was of rust repairs by how sloppily I made this fit. But I mean, overall it's not too bad until you get the laser level out and realize you've completely messed up. A lot of measuring went into trying to figure out where the actual problem was. I ended up removing the top so I could grind it to fit like the other side and then weld it back on. Instantly much better for something that makes absolutely zero functional difference. Again, trying to get back to placing the rear axle. I made this fairly solid piece that will get welded into the rectangular tube. This is to make sure the tube can't flex as you tighten the bolt, as that would make it release over time. You generally don't want something like this, only attached on one end, so my next step will be making some kind of second bracket on the other side here. But this was in March 2021, and I honestly haven't made much progress since. Making all this video has actually been a great help to see how much I've gotten done on the car and has really lit my will to work on it. So, resuming work, I figured we'd have a quick walk around the car. This is the state of the car as we enter 2022. Rear right wheel well still needs to be redone. The wheel arch itself needs to be modified to match the left side. Area behind the passenger door needs major work to fix some old crash damage. Obviously need to replicate the old floor but with extra space for transmission and drive shaft. Figure out some kind of steering since I don't want to keep the old worm gear. Obviously finish the 3-link system where I'm missing both upper and panhard mounts. Also related to that, figure out springs and shocks for the 3-link system. repair the huge chunk I cut out for the middle mount, figure out how I want to run my exhaust, reshape the front wheel wells, try to get a bit more space for my front wheels, figure out some reinforcements for the front end where I can also mount coolers, etc. Do minor rust repair around the front and rear window frames, overhaul the mess up front, finish the engine mounts and fabricate a transmission mount, do a new exhaust manifold that actually fits, figure out the brake system, figure out the ventilation system, finish the bodywork around the modified arch, repair the last rusted areas around the trunk and then come up with a proper idea for bodywork around the trunk. Also need to come up with a fuel system and electrical system, I need to figure out a good driving position, fabricate the steering wheel and shifter mounts to match, etc, etc. The list is quite long. But that's all I got for today. I hope you enjoyed the video. Future videos will be a lot better material since I now fully intend on filming everything I do on this to get rid of these slideshows. Thanks for watching and please leave a comment and click that thumbs up if you liked the video. I love hearing from my viewers and the thumbs up really helps me and my channel. Bye!